Good evening and welcome to St. Lawrence University's online Laurentian Lecture Series. My name is Kim Hissong and I'm the Executive Director of Annual Giving and Laurentian Engagement here at St. Lawrence, and I will help to moderate tonight's lecture. I'd like to cover just a few technical items before we begin. During the lecture, all participants will be muted, and at the end of the lecture, we will invite comments and questions. At that time, you will be able to virtually raise your hand using the hand icon that you should see on the navigation pane at the top right of your screen. The icon is a small hand in blue towards the bottom of your navigation pane. Click it once to raise your hand, and when you're called on, you will be unmuted. A few tips about the webinar audio. If you're using the audio through your computer, please know that you must either have a built-in microphone or an external microphone in order to ask questions. Otherwise, you'll be able to hear us, but we won't be able to hear you. If you're using your telephone audio, if you have your phone on speaker during the lecture, in order for us to hear your question, you will likely need to take the speaker off during that time. We recommend that during the presentation, you minimize the navigation pane by using the orange arrow near the top to minimize the pane. And if you need to maximize the pane at any point to ask a question or to make a comment, simply use the orange arrow to maximize it. So without further delay, I am pleased to introduce our lecturer for the evening, Dr. Matthew Carotenuto, Associate Professor of History. Dr. Carotenuto earned his BA in History from SUNY Cortland and a PhD in African History from Indiana University. His teaching and research interests are broadly defined in both African history and the experience of people of African descent around the world. As a specialist in East Africa, he recently published a co-edited special issue of the International Journal of African Historical Study titled Towards the History of Violence in Colonial Kenya. He has also published articles in African Affairs, Africa Today, and History in Africa on topics related to ethnicity in colonial and post-colonial Kenya. He is currently working on a book manuscript which examines the ways that Africans have historically constructed their ethnic identities in Kenya, as well as a new project which explores the social history of indigenous sporting traditions in East Africa. Outside of his work in the history department, Dr. Carotenuto has been the coordinator of the African Studies program and is an active supporter of study abroad on campus. He is an alumnus of St. Lawrence's Kenya semester program and is the current on-campus coordinator. Tonight's lecture is entitled Deconstructing Tribe and the Politics of Ethnicity in Kenya. So welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Kim. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the Office of Annual Giving and Laurentian Engagement for inviting me. And the buzz of the faculty, I can definitely say, is a great level of excitement for this type of engagement. We love hearing about the fascinating work that alumni do, and I think this is a great opportunity for us to interact and kind of update you, and for those of you who haven't been on campus in a while, update you about the kinds of exciting things that we're doing here on campus, both in the classroom and in some of our own research. In looking at some of the RSVPs tonight, it's wonderful to see a lot of alumni of the Kenya semester program and alums with various backgrounds, even some parents of current students, which is really great. It also warms my heart to see some of my former students on that list. And then I'd just like to say a special word to two people from the spring of '98, and you know who you are, Amy and particularly Paul, who are joining us tonight, and this is really great. I'm really excited to talk to you all and discuss, I think, what's an important topic in both the history of Kenya, but also in contemporary issues. So I'd like to say that this is an interesting time, 2013, 2014, this academic year, for talking about Kenya, and particularly talking about Kenya here at St. Lawrence. As some of you know, it's Kenya's 50th anniversary of independence from British colonial rule this December. And then in the spring of 2014, St. Lawrence University is going to celebrate their 40th year of the semester-long program in Kenya, which some of you are graduates of and alumni of. At the end of the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about some of the activities that we're planning, and hopefully some of you are already thinking about attending the reunion celebrations over reunion weekend in late May and early June, and I'll hopefully have a chance to talk a little bit more about that. So I'd like to say that I consider myself an honorary St. Lawrence alum of sorts. I didn't graduate from St. Lawrence, but I did participate on the Kenya semester program in the spring of '98. And as one of 2,000 alumni from over 30 universities who participated on this program throughout its history, it's certainly a real honor to be both back working here at SLU and with a program with such deep roots in Kenya. So the origins of tonight's lecture began really on my experiences on the Kenya semester program. When I spent a month conducting oral historical research among the Luo community in Western Kenya, and part of me really has never left. My dissertation and much of my published work, as Kim mentioned, has focused on the historic roots of ethnicity and the politics of belonging in Kenya, which is also an important topic of the courses that I teach here at St. Lawrence. As any faculty member, I think, giving a lecture like this would say, the topic that we're going to be talking about tonight is very large, too large to cover it all. So I'm going to try to be highlighting a few things in 3 parts. And so I want to just kind of talk a little bit through what my goals are and hopefully be able to hear a lot of comments and questions from you all at the end. So part 1 of the talk is really going to be deconstructing this word, tribe, that often gets used in discussions of African identities and communities on the continent, and really how it's been used to distort and sometimes oversimplify our understandings of African history. Part 2 of the lecture is going to focus on the colonial roots of how ethnicity in Kenya became a politicized or political identity, and how we cannot really begin to understand contemporary issues without a knowledge of the colonial past. In part 3, I'm going to really focus on where my area of expertise is, the Luo community in Western Kenya, to understand how such a real salient political identity exists for Luo speakers today, those who speak the language of Luo. And I really think this is an idea that applies not just in Western Kenya, but broadly on the African continent, and to understand some of the political applications of ethnicity across many parts of the continent. So to start, I'd just like to say that ethnicity as an identity, I think, is something that is learned and situational. In my classes, we often talk about this in the context of the U.S., and sometimes it's discussed by asking a simple question of sort of, where are you from? And if you think about it, this is one of the most rehearsed and easy questions to answer, and we all use different answers depending on where we are, who we're speaking to, and the overall audience and context. So to just give you one example, in my classes when I talk about this, I often ask that question in the context of those students who migrated from their hometowns to St. Lawrence. And I ask the question of saying, how many of you now consider yourselves or talk about that you're from a larger town or a different area of the country than you really were once you arrived at St. Lawrence? Most people begrudgingly say, yes, I don't really live in Boston, I live outside of Boston. I don't really live in New York City, I live in the suburbs. But nobody will understand that. So I take on a sort of urban Boston or New York identity. The concept here is that we change. Our identity changes in the place that we are. It can evolve, it can be situational, and it can broaden the farther away we get from home. And I think this will be an interesting concept to consider as we think about the experiences in Kenyan history, and particularly in colonial Kenya, for those folks from Western Kenya that I'll talk mainly about, the Luo community. So at first I want to kind of deconstruct this word, tribe. I think it often gets used in common kind of colloquial discourse about ethnicity in Africa. And then it sometimes gets applied to other societies around the world, but not equally. In media and other circles, we don't hear the word tribe, tribalism, tribal applied to all societies around the world. It tends to be selective. In doing a word association with this with students in my classes, students come up with adjectives and descriptions of that word that sometimes connotate very political meanings and sometimes derogatory ones. Words like primitive, primordial, savage, uncivilized are often used in contemporary discourse to describe only certain societies around the world, sometimes in Africa. And it's really an essence in the power dimension in talking about sort of the nations and cultures of Europe versus the tribes of Africa, which is sometimes portrayed in popular discourse. My argument here is that this kind of language and discussion is really rooted firmly in the colonial legacy in Africa, and is perpetuated in large part by popular media and popular discourse. What we're seeing here on the screen, and those of you who may be familiar with this genre, we see 3 comics, all written in the colonial era. So Tarzan is something that many people are familiar with, some maybe have seen even recent films. Edgar Rice Burroughs, the author of the original Tarzan comics, has never went to the African continent and conjured this up in his whole mind. And there was over 40 films made from the 1930s onwards, as well as comic books and graphic novels. And even by 1975, this was grossing $50 million a year as an industry. And if you look at the images of these comics, you see a very sort of stereotypical depiction, sometimes denoting these words, tribe, tribalism, tribal, and their connotations of savage, uncivilized. I put the Tintin in Congo up there because it also connotates a very colonial connection. Here you see Tintin driving an older vehicle throughout the savannah in a pit helmet with a young boy next to him, clearly in a very sort of racialized makeup. This is definitely a product of the era. The Tintin in Congo series was written in 1930 and 1931, firmly during the height of Belgian colonialism in Central Africa. But I put this up here because it was originally written in French. And this image you see here is of a 2005 English press version that was released. And with it, all the kind of memories, experiences, sometimes very racist imagery of the colonial era. So in my classes, we talk about this concept of ethnicity and this word tribe and how it impacts our understandings of calling it that. And I would say from the onset, this is a word that scholars of Africa and scholars of Kenya have rejected, have widely rejected in understanding because we don't think it actually matters and doesn't connotate the kinds of meanings that most importantly Africans have when discussing their own identities. So we might think that this is a bygone era. This is partially firmly in the colonial period. The Tarzan comic from the early 20th century, this Thunda, King of the Congo from 1952, and Tintin from the early 1930s. However, that kind of capturing of colonial history and marketing it, sometimes in more subtle ways, continues really up until the present. So some of you might recognize this very famous actress from a Vogue photo shoot in 2007 titled The Chronicles of Kira, taken on the East African savannah. Here we see Keira Knightley in very colonial period dress, evoking images of the classic hunting safaris of Hemingway and Roosevelt, and the British colonial experience in East Africa. Those of you who know Kenya know that experience well. And here, in a much more subtle way, we see that connotation of power. Keira Knightley standing over very sometimes scantily clad Maasai individuals dressed very differently than her, looking up at her in this striking pose, albeit less impactful than the Tintin in Congo comic. It still connotates some of that lingering influence and legacy of the ways that we construct knowledge and the ways that the colonial experience impacted our understandings of Africa, and particularly here in East Africa. The discipline of African history is also not immune to some of these impacts. This connotation of the word tribe and some of the stereotypes that it perpetuates even impacted the professional scholarly world. For those of you who know African history a little bit, you might know that prior to about the 1960s, you really couldn't get a PhD in African history, and there wasn't really a professional class of African historians working at universities around the world. And so the early 1960s was a time that African historians were really trying to forge a discipline here. and create a place in the discipline of history and also the academy writ large that gave them some sense of legitimacy. And here we have an individual, Hugh Trevor Roper, a very famous historian, the Regis Professor of Modern History at Oxford University from 1957 to 1980. As I told my students in my class last semester when we talked about this, you don't get to be the Regis Professor of Modern History without being very good at what you do. And in 1963, this is what he said about African history. He said, perhaps in the future there will be some African history to teach, but at present time there is none or very little. There is only the history of Europe and Africa. The rest is largely darkness. Connotating images of Conrad's The Heart of Darkness and other novels from the colonial era, this was clearly a slap at professional historians trying to promote the legitimate and very scholarly study of Africa. He caught some slack for this. He wasn't without his criticism. So 6 years later, he published a retort. And this is what he said 6 years later. African history is only the unedifying gyrations of barbarous tribes in picturesque but irrelevant corners of the globe. So the point here is to emphasize that stereotypes, the politics of language, the use of the word tribe and others to describe African history has meaning, and it's long had a meaning, and that meaning is rooted in an understanding of the colonial era, and it's even impacted professional scholarship. Again, these examples really focus on an era that is quite far removed from where we are here in 2013, 50 years later after Hugh Trevor Roper's initial remarks. But if we kind of narrow the focus a little bit on Kenya and we think a little bit about a specific example, some of you might know and may have been very impacted by the 2007-2008 presidential elections in Kenya, where the election results and a very disputed and hotly contested election spilled over into some very violent times in early 2008, which left about 1,000 people dead and 600,000 people displaced by this level of violence. That violence has gone away. It didn't rear its head in 2013 when we had a recent election. But the coverage of by popular media and well-respected media around the world of this kind of reemphasizes a very myopic view of Kenyan history. So you see here in headlines from early 2008 from CNN, the LA Times, the Associated Press, BBC, clearly focusing on one dimension of a very contested, complex, political situation in Kenya that unfortunately got out of hand and resulted in some severe acts of violence. So you notice that there are many uses of the word tribe here, focusing on implements of violence, and really don't give you any understanding outside of one explanatory root, ethnicity. And I'll highlight just one example of this. The East African correspondent, the current one from the New York Times, a guy named Jeffrey Gettleman, wrote in 2007, the late December 31st, he wrote, with the president, Mwai Kibaki, a Kikuyu, and Mr. Odinga, a Luo, the election seems to have tapped into an atavistic vein of tribal tensions that always lay beneath the surface in Kenya, but until now had not provoked widespread mayhem. Again, kind of focusing on that there's this primordial, ancient notion of not only ethnicity, but violence associated with ethnicity, which I think really escapes and really marginalizes some of the much more complex understandings of this particular event, but also Kenyan history as a whole. So my goal this talk is to really not just deconstruct this word in popular media and today and its uses in a historical framework, but to understand from an African perspective how we can really think about the role ethnicity played and how ethnicity and the idea of it has changed over time in Kenya. And that's going to take us back a ways. Just focusing again on some of the media coverage of this notion of, tribalism, even focusing on the implements of war and violence rather than understanding its roots was common. And is still common in coverage of the African continent. I'm sure some of you may be familiar with it. Maybe some of you were even reading something today that's reminiscent of this kind of genre. This particular example comes from a Time magazine photographic shoot that took place in February 2008. That basically, this is the amount of text they included. This little blurb here under the title of Kenyan tribes wage war with bows and arrows. Again, focusing on something primordial that I said, and I think scholars would agree, is just really not true. So to kind of set the context a little bit for what we're talking about, I want to take us back a little bit to the colonial era. Here we see a map of colonial Africa in 1914, and really during this time period what we think of as the spread of colonial rule, the takeover of the African continent from the late 1880s all the way up until the First World War. The mentality of officials, British, German, French, and others who took under this project of invading, taking over, and carving up the African continent can be encapsulated, I think, by a quote here from Cecil Rhodes, the famous architect and first chairman of the De Beers Mining Corporation in South Africa, where he wrote in his will and testament, basically in 1877, that Africa is still lying ready for us, and it is our duty to take it. It is our duty to seize every opportunity of acquiring more territory. More territory simply means more of the Anglo-Saxon race, more of the best, most human, most honorable race the world possesses. So we joke in my classes that clearly Cecil Rhodes was a very shy guy. He didn't like to boast about this. And he clearly saw himself and where he was from, Britain, as the pinnacle of the world. This is more about, just as much about ethnocentrism as it is about race. He's noting the Anglo-Saxon race clearly was more in his mind than the French, as regardless of Africans themselves. British press here, you see in 1902, poked fun at him upon his death with his kind of worldview of the British in Africa, here spanning the African continent all the way from Cape Town to Cairo. But if you notice here on the map of Africa, his vision was almost complete. The red represents the parts of the African continent that the British ended up taking control over, all the way basically from Egypt to South Africa, with few exceptions here in German East Africa. But as many of you might know, Germany, as a result of losing the First World War, lost their colonies, and Tanganyika, which would become Tanzania after independence, became a British colony. So there was a red line basically all the way from Cape Town to Cairo, including the highlands of East Africa, which is the focus of what we want to talk about. The justification of colonial rule by people like Cecil Rhodes speaks to the ways that British officials, missionaries, and white settlers who would come to Kenya at a later time would think about the African societies they interacted with. And this was at the peak of notions of scientific racism in Europe. And this idea of that it was their duty, the white man's burden, to spread both Christianity, civilization, and commerce. And sometimes these mix together. In this famous advertisement from 1900 that appeared in Harper's Weekly, you see here literally a direct reference to the white man's burden, and in an advertisement for soap, that clearly the notions of civilization and commerce are connected, that you need to use a very certain type of soap to represent a high level of civilization. There's a long history, if you look online, for Pear soap ads, of much more blatant racist ads like this in the 19th century. But this was part of the message, not only going to the African continent to take over, but to sell products, spread notions of European culture, and with it, European religion, at least in the British minds, that of Christianity. Now, to think about the colonial project in East Africa and the ways that it impacts Kenyans in particularly, but through most of British colonial Africa, you have to think a little bit about the hierarchy of colonial rule. And the way that the colonial system worked, as many of you might be familiar, if you're familiar with African history a little bit, it was ruled basically through the colonial office in Europe. If you go to London, there is still Africa House in downtown London, which no longer contains the colonial office, but its legacy and architectural remnants is still there. And then orders would come down to European governors, and these were almost, I think without exception, exclusively European men, who would then hand down their orders to provincial and district commissioners that would carve up the country into provinces and districts. But then on the local level, the vast majority of civil servants on the African continent were Africans. And so from the beginning, you have Africans being employed in the colonial service as chiefs, headmen, tax collectors, police officers, clerks in government offices, who did the vast amount of day-to-day work of running the colony. Now, for scholars of colonial Africa and for understanding our ideas of ethnicity and the politics of identity in Kenya, this is an important point. This elevated certain individuals, as you see here from a photograph of two colonial officials in Sudan. This gave them power and authority over their community members in ways that they never had before, and often created internal conflicts at the local level. And you can see here what it also did is it encouraged colonial officials to need to really divide up people and understand them in very sort of units that may or may not have been the ways that Africans themselves identified themselves. So to connect it to this kind of idea of ethnicity, Europeans imported a very European idea of ethnicity to the African continent. And here you have a very famous quote from a historian of Tanzania, John Iliff, who wrote in 1979 that colonial administrators believed that Africans belonged to a tribe just as every European belonged to a nation. They had this idea that quote, tribal identity or ethnicity in Africa was inherent, something that people were born with, something that was very instilled. They didn't question it. And they ascribed identities onto Africans in ways that Africans might not have thought of that either prior to European arrival or even during the early colonial period. So that's an important point to kind of think about, particularly as we talk about the specific case of Kenya and more specifically the Luo community in Western Kenya. Now, like most African countries, Kenya is a very diverse place. Its current population is over 40 million, even though this map gives us an estimate from 2007. There are over 40 languages spoken in Kenya, and there is no majority. So even this Kikuyu language group, which is the largest, only represents 20% of the population. So Kenya, like most or every other part of the African continent, is a very culturally and linguistically diverse place. And prior to colonial rule, there was really no notion of Kenya itself. This was a creation of the British colonial project in East Africa. So we're going to be talking about Kenya more broadly, but if you focus here on the western part, this red area where you see the word Nyanza, right by Lake Victoria here, is a specific area that we're going to focus on because that's where the Luo community is and where my area of expertise and research has been. So I want to think a little bit about how Africans may have defined their own notions of ethnicity prior to Europeans arriving. I think this is an important point. So when we think about pre-colonial Africa, we can't think about time immemorial prior to Europeans arriving, but let's think about the 19th century or the 1800s. And if you look here on this map, this is just a map showing the areas of the African continent that have had a long history of large-scale states or kingdoms. And you see West Africa has a very different environment than in East Africa. You'll notice there are no sort of large empires in the interior of Kenya or Tanzania, and that there's really no history of large-scale political states there, where larger identities, either on the basis of ethnicity or what we think of as nations, modern nation states today, could have existed. And one of the ways that historians of Africa and of ethnicity in Africa argue that really tribe doesn't encapsulate the understandings of the ways that Africans define themselves is really through language. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So if we take the word for tribe in Swahili, it's kabila. And this is actually not an indigenous word in East Africa. It's actually borrowed from Arabic. About 15% of all words in Swahili are borrowed from outside of the African continent. But it's telling here that here a word that you would think would be very important to the community does not actually originate there. So how do Africans tend to describe themselves and their ethnicity? If we stay with Swahili, if you were to say Swahili people or a Swahili person or the Swahili, you would use the prefixes M or for one person, or if I am a Swahili person, I would say Mimi Swahili. Or I'm talking about Swahili people, I would say wa Swahili. So really what you're talking about is people who speak the Swahili language, or if you look at the root of the word Swahili, people who live along the coast. So this doesn't connotate the word tribe, and for the most part, you find that these examples actually link back to language. In Western Kenya, another example of the Luo community, the root of Luo really comes from the language, Luo. And if you wanted to say Luo person or people, you would say Ja or JA for a single, JO for. This is an interesting idea as we think about that. Really, in African languages, there is, with very few exceptions, a word for that would translate as tribe. Now, if we think about East Africa and we focus a little bit more about the colonial project, most scholars of Kenya and of East Africa will tell you that the colonial experience went with the railway. And what distinguishes East Africa from other parts of the African continent, you can kind of get a sense of in these early 20th century advertisements. So from 1896 to 1901, there was a railway built starting on the coast of Kenya in Mombasa and eventually connecting all the way into Uganda. Called the Uganda Railway. It was a big infrastructure project. And if you see here, it really opened up the country to British travelers. These advertisements may have inspired the famous hunting safaris of people like Teddy Roosevelt in 1909. And what you're seeing here is it's also advertising here a winter home for aristocrats. It's advertising settlement. And what distinguishes some of the colonial experience from, let's say, East Africa to much of West Africa is that Kenya was very much a settler colony, and it had a large population of white settlers who came, and with that brought their own problems and challenges. When the railway was created and the white settlement came in and advertisements like you saw on the previous slide started showing up in newspapers in Europe, a slow but steady influx of white settlers began from Britain itself, from South Africa, from other parts of the African continent, and other parts of Europe. What you see here in a photograph here is of a young Norwegian boy in what would be called, later be called, the White Highlands of Kenya. So through a few laws and procedures called the Crown's Land Ordinance in 1902 and 1915 in particular, the Kenyan colonial government alienated about 7 million acres of the best farmland in central Kenya for whites only, particularly the highland regions around Nairobi, in the western Rift Valley, and up around the regions of Mount Kenya itself in the central parts of the country. This was alienated large amounts of land to Africans, many of whom had to go and work as squatters, as sharecrop farmers on their own land. Others who were forced to move off those lands and move into what they were created as native reserves. This was an important idea that it gave territorial identity on the basis of ethnicity. So there was a Kikuyu reserve, there was a Luo reserve as ascribed by the British. And for the first time, we start seeing these kind of words that would really be described for someone's language being applied to a place, an area of the country, and a territory with boundaries. Now, if we focus from a kind of broad idea of colonial Kenya to Western Kenya, I want to make a distinction here that not all of Kenya experienced the colonial system and the colonial experience the same way. If you look at the lush but very malarial-prone shores of Western Kenya, these weren't places where Europeans went to live. And for the Africans living around Lake Victoria, they didn't lose land like some communities in central Kenya. So that's an important distinction and actually shaped some of the ways that Luo speakers in Western Kenya experienced the colonial project. Now, if we look at the Luo community itself, like much of the African continent, there is no notion of a Luo identity writ large prior to colonial rule. There was no Luo empire. There was no Luo kingdom. This was a word that would be described primarily as a language group. And if we look back at some of the traditions, oral traditions, and other evidence we have of this region, at best we could maybe divide up the region into these very kind of localized identities. And when I did research on this in the colonial archives and interviewing folks in Western Kenya, they talked about these as being locational identities, and that maybe Luo wasn't a primary identity that people kind of ascribed to in the early colonial period. Evidence from the colonial record up until the 1930s and 40s would suggest that people weren't identifying themselves primarily as Luo until almost really the Second World War. So really what I want to talk about now is kind of focusing on how that could have happened, how that shift in identity could have happened, both from the concept of Europeans at the top of the colonial system, but also from below, from the grassroots. What role did Africans play? Well, taking us back again to that notion of where are you from and how your identity might change the further away you get from home. This very much applies to the colonial experience of Luo speakers in Western Kenya. So unlike central Kenya where people lost large tracts of land, Luo speakers in Western Kenya, that area primarily became a labor reserve. And throughout the colonial period, we have tens of thousands of particularly young men who migrated from the western Kenyan shores of Lake Victoria all throughout East Africa, particularly to the urban environments of places like Nairobi, Mombasa on the coast, into Tanzania, Dar es Salaam, into Uganda, Kampala, and even as far as Sudan and Ethiopia. And by leaving home, scholars and the informants that I interviewed started talking about how the language of Luo and other sort of senses of identity start to become more important. Now, to think about the urban experience in Kenya, just very briefly, if we focus on the capital city of Nairobi, Nairobi was a colonial creation. It didn't exist prior to the railway getting there in the early 1900s. This is a photograph from 1908 of a very dusty, kind of dirt, temporary marketplace kind of environment of Nairobi. But like many cities across the African continent, it experienced rapid growth. So here's Nairobi by 1950. With a population of about 120,000. And here's Nairobi today, of a population of over 3 million. So basically, the 20th century, we can think of Nairobi's population going from virtually nothing to 3 million people. And so that's a rapid period of growth. And that impacted the ways both the government dealt with this expansion, but how Africans responded, in particular in relation to identity. So this rapid period of growth that began in the early 20th century scared colonial officials. What you see here is an attempt to try to control the movement and the massive influx of Africans to the urban environment. What you see here is a passbook, this from the 1950s, literally ascribing the Kikuyu Embu Meru passbook, a special one given for communities from that area of Kenya, but one that would ascribe an ethnic identity onto people and also prohibit them without permission of an employer to come and have freedom of movement throughout the colony. And the basic tenets of this policy is based off of a very deep-seated and widely ascribed to ideology that here in this Native Affairs Department report from the Kenya National Archives noted in 1926 that a town is a European area in which there is no place for the redundant native, who neither works nor serves his people but forms the class from which professional agitators, slum landlords, liquor sellers, prostitutes, and other undesirable classes spring. The exclusion of these redundant natives is in the interests of Europeans and natives alike. So clearly the notion was, that we know now, that the urban environment was one of these places that was reserved for whites only. And Africans who lived in that environment, even sometimes for decades, were always considered temporary residents who needed to be controlled and who often needed to carry an identity card that listed them with a rural place of belonging and an ethnic place of belonging. Now, what did Africans do in response to this? So my dissertation and my book project deals primarily with the Luo community in Western Kenya, and particularly through the associational history of a group called the Luo Union, or in Luo, Wiruak Luo. What you see here is a photograph from the 1953 Delegates Conference of the Luo Union, a time when the organization had 60 branches and 1,000 members in both Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. And really what this was a response to this notion that Europeans were forcing people to kind of have a sense of identity upon them. The Luo unions formed in response because there was this fear of undisciplined and uncontrolled Africans in towns, and organizations like this were seen as, and encouraged by the colonial state, as something that could mediate that, control that, represent it, and worked within the preferred confines of the colonial government that the British officials would want Africans in Kenya to think of themselves as members of quote-unquote tribes and not as Kenyans themselves, purely for divide and rule tactics. So organizations like this, and the Luo Union was one of the most noted of them, happened all over the continent and all over Kenya. If we look briefly at their constitution, here in 1945, you see an image of the actual constitution from the Kenya National Archives in Nairobi. But I'll just highlight a couple things I think that are very important to notions of changing identity. So in their 1945 constitution, the Luo Union's primary goal was to promote mutual understanding and unity among Luo, quote, as a tribe for practical purposes. So this notion understands that there was not unity prior to this, that there was need for an organization to come in here and really promote this identity among people who speak the language. And in doing so, they were going to, quote, study and select Luo customs which were decent and compatible with progress to try to preserve them and encourage their practice. On the contrary to that, to study and offer a united resistance against any unprogressive modern influence, and then publish a paper in Luo. So what you see here is an attempt to really manage an identity, to define one, to say what is Luo, what it means to be a morally responsible person, by studying the certain customs, by promoting certain things, discouraging other things, really managing an identity from the top down. This was encouraged by the colonial state because the government feared of something they called detribalization. They wanted Africans to think of themselves as rural residents in a very primordial and ancient way, and controlled by that discipline in the rural areas. And from this quote from an administrator in Tanzania defining this, they thought of this as a very bad thing, this notion that Africans were separated from family, clan, and tribal authority, as well as social codes of behavior, discipline, and custom, and perhaps religion, which originally guided their thoughts and actions. This idea was ascribed mainly to Africans who lived in urban areas. And organizations like the Luo Union that were emphasizing an ethnic identity and a morally responsible one that was going to stamp out unprogressive influences, this fit well with the colonial state and allowed them to be encouraged and even sometimes sponsored financially. The Luo Union did publish a newspaper. They called it Ramogi. It was in the Luo, or the Luo language. Ramogi is an interesting title for that newspaper. If you study the oral traditions of the Luo community, there's a belief that all Luo speakers originate from one founding ancestor who migrated in from Uganda probably around 1500 or so is the idea. And his name was Ramogi. So by calling it this, there was trying this attempt to really get forth an idea that everyone is related, that this is a big family. And really by publishing it in Luo, it targeted a very specific audience. And by promoting the Luo language in its written form, it was promoting this identity as well. When I spoke with the founder, Achin Oneko, in 2006 at his home here in Western Kenya, he noted that one of the tricks Ramogi used is that they would publish some pro-colonial propaganda front couple pages. And that made colonial officials quite happy, who were reluctant to have it translated and really read what was going on in the interior. It allowed them to have a wide circulation at times when being overtly political was quite difficult. The other thing you mentioned about that is that sort of notion of being connected at home the farther away you get. So when you travel around East Africa today, there are ethnic neighborhoods as a result of this colonial expansion of migrant labor. So if I was to go to Kampala, Mwanza in Tanzania, Arusha, Mombasa, Dar es Salaam, Nairobi, and I wanted to know where there was a large Luo community, I might ask where the Kisumu Ndogo is, the little Kisumu, which is the urban civil and the major city in western Kenya. And when I spoke with people that lived during the colonial period, they remember getting this newspaper, Ramogi, and reading it in a group, often out loud with each other. And they remarked, actually, that they were never interested in all these little happenings at home until they moved away from home. Until they were far away from home, that connection or somebody that spoke the same language as them didn't really matter. But all of a sudden, when they were in coastal Tanzania, hearing all these dozens of languages, when they saw a Luo language newspaper on the streets or they heard someone speaking it, it gave them a sense of affinity with each other. And it promoted that sense of identity and shared heritage and experience as they moved away from western Kenya. There was also concerted efforts by these groups, the Luo Union as well, to promote ethnicity through symbols, both tangible and otherwise. So on the screen here, you see a photograph of one of the first African-built buildings in western Kenya in the city of Kisumu, called the Ofafa Memorial Hall, named after a counselor in Nairobi named Ambrose Ofafa, who was killed in the 1950s. And it was the headquarters of the Luo Union, where it still is today. And when you talk to people about what went on there, they talked a lot about having dances, cultural events, debates about Luo culture and tradition. And behind it, there's a small soccer pitch where soccer teams formed in these ethnic associations. And the Luo Union and others were actually some of the sponsors of what would become, and what still is today, the most famous professional football teams in Kenya. So what you see here is the signature of Gor Mahia. Gor Mahia is one of the most popular teams in Kenya, one of the most successful professional clubs based in Nairobi. Gor Mahia is a kind of folk hero in Luo history and definitely appeals to a certain group. The AFC Leopards is probably the other most historic football team, and that actually translates to the Abaluya Football Club, which was sponsored by the Abaluya Ethnic Association, a neighboring group here in western Kenya. So even sports teams have their link and roots in some of the ethnic associations of the colonial era. And when I talked to some fans of Gor Mahia over the summer when I was in Kenya, they noted very openly that by going to a Gor Mahia match in Nairobi, they felt more Luo. They felt pride in that identity and that connection. And so it helps to reinforce that in a cultural way. Now, I'm going to go briefly through this because I want to make sure we have time for comments and questions. That this kind of colonial view of ethnicity, was pervasive throughout the colonial period. And made it very problematic when Africans tried to unite broadly across the continent really after the Second World War and all the way up through the 1960s, this kind of struggle for independence. So this really is rooted in the 1940s all the way up to the 1960s for Kenya. And this quote here from Sir Alan Russell, which was tabled in Parliament in Britain in 1943, really kind of speaks to this pervasive view that independence was not something that could be achieved. And the reason being is that had to do with ethnicity. As he quotes here, these tribes speak different languages and have entirely different social customs. Many of them are in a very, quote, primitive state, and it is not possible to envision the time when they will become sufficiently united as a whole, speaking a common language and having trust in their elected leaders from their own tribe, or still less, another tribe. This would be much easier to make a united Europe under the domination of Germany than make a united Kenya under the domination of the Maasai. So clearly there was this kind of pejorative way of looking at identity in Kenya as a justification for the continued need for colonial rule. That being said, politics in Kenya did unite broadly in this time period across ethnic groups. The formations of the first major political party, the Kenya African National Union, which would take power after independence, you see here in this poster. Africans across the country joined this political party regardless of their ethnic affiliation or the language that they spoke. Now, it complicates things a little bit in this period that many of you might know or have heard about a very violent struggle for independence called the Mau Mau Uprising in central Kenya in the 1950s for the most part. I don't want to talk, we don't have time to talk a lot about this. I'm happy to talk about it during questions. But I just want to note that this time period in the struggle for independence in Kenya was very contentious and very, very difficult. This time period, scholars sort of argue that maybe up to 100,000 people died as a result of this uprising. Mau Mau is kind of a term of contempt that the British used for this uprising. The people who went to the forests in central Kenya to fight for both freedom and their own rights had a clear idea of what they were doing. They called themselves the Land and Freedom Army. One of the ways that this is quite contentious and actually impacts Kenya long after independence is achieved, you can kind of see from this photograph of Africans being put into a prison camp after being caught or accused of being associated with Mau Mau. You notice here, going back to the role that Africans have historically played in the colonial era, that the guards guarding them, the police officers, are fellow Kenyans. And that this experience really represents some of the internal divisions that were created and exacerbated in the colonial era and had a legacy long after independence. So I focused primarily my talk on the colonial period, but I want to just bring us up more towards the present before we end with some questions, just to kind of see some of the long-term impact of that. Now, Kenya did achieve independence in 1963. Its leader, the first elected president, Jomo Kenyatta, won a resounding victory, electoral victory, in the early 60s with broad support all across Kenya. He ruled until his death in 1978, where his vice president took over, a guy named Daniel Arap Moi, and ruled until 2002. The notion that Kenya only had 2 presidents in 40 years should signal something. There is an unfortunate history that, starting with Kenyatta and followed by Moi, there was this idea that there was the all-powerful executive branch in Kenya, with very little checks and balances to its power. If one is benevolent and to the country as a whole, that might work, but also leaves an unfortunate legacy into how the politics of ethnicity transformed from the colonial period really until independence and the colonial era after 1963. So to think about Kenyatta a little bit, the first president, because of divide and rule tactics under British colonial rule, if one was going to form a political party or garner political support, they really had to do it through ethnic affiliations to begin with. Kenyatta was made famous in the 1930s when he went to London and studied under famous anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, and his dissertation, his BA dissertation at the London School of Economics, ended up being this book called Facing Mount Kenya, which is really an ethnography of the Kikuyu people. So what you have here is that the first president of Kenya kind of cut his political teeth as a leader of a single ethnic group. And after independence, instead of embracing all peoples across the society, he tended to retreat to some of that political base. Many of his closest advisors, cabinet posts, became and were appointed by members of their own ethnic group. Some people refer to this as what they call the Mount Kenya Mafia, noting this kind of clique of individuals from the home regions of Kenyatta and the Kikuyu people. What we have here in post-colonial Kenya, broadly defined, is really an association with kind of national politics and development. If one is with the government, if one is in favor of the government, then the politics of development or infrastructure, schools, hospitals were developed and money flowed. But if we take the case of Western Kenya, that was quite contentious. So if we look at the Luo community again, to focus on that, after about 1966, for a variety of reasons I'm happy to get into during the question and answer period, the main political leaders of the Luo community kind of split with Kenyatta over ideological issues. And as a result here, the development tap was turned off. Luo politicians in that area remained really in the political opposition in Kenya all the way up until 2002. And when I originally went to Western Kenya in the late 90s, the road network was emblematic of this. The major highways all the way to Uganda looked more like the big potholed ones than they did even very shortly after 2002 when the Luo community kind of came back into government. So this is a clear sign that when you fall out of disfavor with the Kenyan government, there's this kind of regional disparity. And Western Kenya was one of these places that it was very pronounced. So what this did was it creates this culture that this very interesting comic here from actually Nigeria, I think, gives us a sense of. So scholars of Africa kind of call this politics of the belly. And there's this notion in Kenya that if we can just get our guy into power, it will be our turn to eat. So this notion literally of eating from the spoils of government. Here you literally see this politician or as they're calling the oppressor, literally growing fat off of his power. And that notion that development money, if one gains the presidency or high political office, will be siphoned off into your area more so than it will be somewhere else. And this has been an unfortunate era in practice in Kenyan history, which has really exacerbated the notion that ethnicity still matters. I'll just end briefly with a few more comments here about the Luo community bringing us up more towards the present. So what that kind of policy did was for the Luo community was have them retreat inward and really focus development ideology on the politics of home. So one of the projects the Luo Union did after independence was they raised money for this college in Western Kenya called the Ramogi Institute of Advanced Technology. Again, using that notion of a founding ancestor to link people up in the whole region. In 2004, when I visited the Ramogi Institute of Advanced Technology, which is right near the city of Kisumu here at the end of the Wenam Gulf on this map, and here the principal took me to the top of the student dorm. I thought he took me here just to clearly say what a great view this was of Lake Victoria. And I kind of mentioned to him, hey, you should put a cafe or something up here, and this would be wonderful. But he brought me up here for a very specific point. He said, even in the post-colonial era, I asked him why the Luo Union and actually decided to put this institute in this particular location high above the city of Kisumu, which actually makes it a little bit difficult to get to. He said it was a very distinctive idea, and it relates to what you see here on the map. Because at this elevation on a very clear day, you can see basically all of the areas of Luo land, the places that people speak the Luo language. And he made a distinctive point to me that the Luo Union had this notion that they had to unify, they had to continually unify people. And that project of promoting ethnicity, which started in the colonial period, continued long after independence. Ethnic associations in Kenya were officially banned in 1980, but in recent years we have a rebirth of these kind of organizations. So for the Luo Union, it became reborn as the Luo Council of Elders. And if you go on the popular news sources like the Daily Nation or the East African Standard, the two major Kenyan newspapers, you'll often find references to various councils of elders providing advice or commentary to politicians or other development projects throughout the country. So there's still this kind of colonial notions of ethnic associations operating, albeit on a lesser form, but this links back to that earlier history. Again, kind of promoting that earlier history, you have here also these organizations continue to promote sort of cultural ideas, whether it's visiting sacred sites and promoting cultural tourism, whether it's building a Luo Heroes Gallery, as you see here in this small local museum. This kind of idea is used to promote cultural identity, language, and again, reinforce that ethnicity is an important identity here in Kenya. So I'll end our talk tonight just by kind of bringing it back a little bit and how this kind of notion of ethnicity and its colonial roots and the politics of identity in Kenya even impact the ways that Kenyans view political events far away from home. 2004, when I did my dissertation research in Western Kenya, was quite an interesting year because it was the year now President Barack Obama was elected to the Senate. And I started getting these questions in Western Kenya about who is this boy from Illinois whose father grew up in Western Kenya and who was known in that community. And you started to see newspaper articles in Western Kenya and in the big newspapers, and occasionally by 2008 here, literally comics satirizing the obsession with the connection between Obama and Kenya for Kenyan communities, kind of claiming him as their own. Scratching beneath the surface here, you started to hear a lot of questions about, particularly Obama, that link back to sort of this notion of ethnicity from the past, and also how it became a politicized identity in the present. While when President Obama won election in 2008, Kenya declared it a national holiday, behind the scenes there was this notion that he wasn't just Kenyan, but he was seen as an honorary Luo person. So here is one of my favorite images from the Associated Press of this man here in Western Kenya outside of Barack Obama's grandmother's ancestral home, watching CNN with his sort of Obama hat made from all the photographs in the Kenyan newspapers. So there was this big coverage. In 2004, when he was elected to the Senate, the Kenya breweries started a Senator beer that was sold in local bars. And of course, in 2008, they had to go back to that and start the President beer. And for those of you who remember the campaigns of 2008, you might remember a billboard like this or other campaign materials that were floated around the U.S. This particular billboard you see here on the bottom left actually comes from the city of Kisumu, where no Kenyans were allowed to vote, but clearly there was this notion that they were claiming him and they were seeing this as an ascendancy of the Luo to the White House, even before a Luo had ever been elected to the State House or the presidency of Kenya. So really this is an idea of kind of marketing ethnicity, and I'll just end this way. There's a recent book by some scholars, the Komaroffs, two very well-known anthropologists, who literally write about ethnicity incorporated in Africa, promoting a corporate identity. And the Obama ascendancy to the political office of President of the United States has really fostered this in Western Kenya. The Kenyan government have promoted cultural tourism in Western Kenya, thinking that there are going to be all these heritage tours. Here, a very famous Luo journalist in the Daily Nation quoted in 2009 at the inauguration that as far as the Luo are concerned, Barack Obama is 200% Luo. And here are two photographs from my most recent trip in 2013 to Western Kenya, everywhere from an average strip mall, renaming it the Obama Plaza, to the 2006 renaming of a local secondary school in Western Kenya to the Senator Obama Kogelo Secondary School. So these kind of things are everywhere. And they really are linked back not just to this sort of connection to the heritage of the U.S. president in Kenya, but also particularly kind of filtered through this idea of ethnicity. So I think I'm going to end there and maybe take some questions before we get into maybe talking a little bit about the reunion. So thank you very much.
All right. So just as a reminder, to ask a question or to make a comment, if you look at the side portion of your navigation pane, you should see a hand icon. If you click on that once, it will raise your hand, and we will call on you, and you'll be able to ask your question or make your comment. So if you want to take a moment, think about a comment or a question that you might have. I'm going to look down to the list and see if we have any comments or questions from anyone. Okay. It looks like we have a question from Frederick Kuro. Frederick, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and you can go ahead and take.
Thank you very much. Hello. My name is Frederick. Hello.
Yes, hello. We can hear you.
My name is Frederick. I'm from Kenya, but I'm currently in New York, Syracuse.
Wonderful.
I'm so much impressed by the presentation by Matthew, and I have come to learn so many things that I didn't know. Just wanted to ask, is there any continuation by our current crop of politicians of what the colonialists were doing? Because I see as if there is a lot of similarities between what the colonialists did and what our current politicians are doing right now. Because I see our politicians are dividing the people along these tribal lines for their own political ends.
Yeah, Frederick, thank you for that very interesting question. I mean, I think, kind of understanding more contemporary or post-colonial politics through a notion of continuity with the colonial past is an important one. If you look at the way the government of Kenya was set up after independence, and really up until absolutely the new constitution took over in 2013, you can see vestiges of the colonial era almost at every level. And I'll give you one example. So even up until today, we still have the provincial administration. There's still a PC, or a provincial commissioner, district commissioners. Things that existed in the colonial era as appointed positions and really kind of spoke to that level of constitutional authority that went all the way up into the present. I also think you made a good point that I mean, I do think ethnicity matters at the voting booth. In Kenya, clearly the electoral evidence would suggest that. But as you mentioned, I think the important part is that you have here sort of politicians at the top that are using that or inciting it sometimes or encouraging people to vote along those lines as a way to garner support from certain regions. So I do think that that's a very interesting point about kind of thinking about connections between the colonial era and today. And my final point on that is that even up until relatively recently, you had members of the Kenyan government who started as colonial officials. So the former minister, John Michuki, is one example who started as, I believe, a district officer in the colonial era. Mwai Kibaki had been in the Kenyan government ever since independence. So this notion of where did they get their political experience, it often came from the late colonial era.
You're right, you're right. So we thought that with the new constitution and a devolved government, whereby the resources would be shared equally and distributed along the counties, the 47 counties, we thought that this idea would come to an end. But apparently there is no change. Everything seems to be the same way. We had thought that the devolved government would get rid of this, but it's so unfortunate that it hasn't done much.
Yeah, I agree that there's still frustration that the new constitution, the provisions in that for really that would check the balance of the power of the presidency have not really been fully implemented.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your question, Frederick.
Thank you. Welcome.
Okay, it looks like we have another question or comment from Christopher Burns. Christopher, did you want to ask your question or make a comment?
Sure. Thank you, Kim. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Wonderful. First of all, this past hour and a half has been incredibly stimulating, so I really appreciate St. Lawrence and you, Matt, putting together the presentation. And I was out in, I guess, Kisumu area last May up in Bungoma, so that was my most recent foray into the country, so it's great to hear you focus so much on the little. This is primarily a comment, really, and perhaps it stems from my time at St. Lawrence focusing on African studies, but certainly it comes from my 17 years of international development experience. And I would say, by and large, development practitioners recognize the inherent negatives and stereotypes that come with using the term tribe, et cetera, as opposed to using the term ethnic group. So we tend to focus on the latter. And as you pointed out, the press and other sectors, not so much. And I can say that with a fair measure of comfort, this is fairly true across most of sub-Saharan Africa. We really do strive to use the term ethnic group as opposed to others. That said, even within the development community, I would say that the constant outlier tends to be Kenya, maybe to some extent DRC and other parts of Central Africa. So with your presentation in mind, recognizing that obviously the colonial history expands the continent, it's really curious to me that even amongst my own colleagues, that Kenya seems to, or rather others seem to embrace the more negative term for Kenya, and just wondering if you've ever given any thought to why even amongst this crowd that seems to be the case. Thanks.
Yeah, Chris, thanks a lot, and definitely, drawing on your long experience in development work across the continent, I really appreciate that. It's an interesting question about, I would say development work has evolved better than the press. I know if I kind of cite maybe the long-standing debate that scholars have had with Jeffrey Gettleman, the East Africa correspondent for the New York Times, there's a lot of critique of his coverage of Kenya and this kind of always coming back to ethnicity and tribe. And he adamantly says, well, Kenyans use the word, so I can use it. And that's been a common defense. And so I, not having traveled as widely across, let's say, West Africa, I don't necessarily know how much that English translation of tribe is used. I mean, and I should note that, the way that tribe came into the colonial discourse is because anthropologists promoted it in the 30s and 40s as a better alternative to the word savage. So this is a PC term when it came out, as opposed to a very, very negative term, as we would, I think, all say categorically. But that kind of still falling back on that defense that Africans use the word, or the English word, to talk about that has been something that I've seen in the press. And I would wonder if the development community in East Africa would have a similar argument. So thanks a lot for your question. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'd be surprised, but thank you.
We're just going to see if there are any other comments or questions. Again, if you have a comment or you have a question, please use the hand icon to raise your hand.
All right. Well, maybe I could just use this moment as people are maybe thinking through and digesting some of the material today. And I really appreciate the comments so far. If you look up on the screen here, I just wanted to mention, as many of you might hopefully already know, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, this year is a pretty important year, not just for Kenya's 50th anniversary of independence, but for St. Lawrence's connection. As one of the oldest study abroad programs on the African continent, our semester-long Kenya program started in 1974 and will celebrate its 40th year in 2014. If you look up here, and some of you might be able to visit the website on the alumni page or the reunion page, welcoming you to a special celebration of our Kenya connection. on May 29th to June 1st, 2014. We're busy here on campus planning, I think, a really interesting event. A number of key people, former staff members of the program, someone who's with us tonight, I'll call out Paul Robinson, has already told me he's coming, and now I've said it publicly online, so he'll have to come. That many of you know. Others, they're developing a broad list. And we really encourage you to come. I think it's a really nice and interesting and special time to celebrate this connection to a part of the African continent that has really meant so much. And so you see here, I tried to encapsulate, which is impossible, the 40 years of experience in 6 photographs here. But I would say that, it's really important here at St. Lawrence, and for me particularly, I would say I'm biased, but for the African Studies program, to foster that connection. And it has produced, I think, some wonderful results. Our staff in Kenya, many of whom have been with us for decades, are absolutely brilliant scholarship winners who come from Kenya on an annual basis. 4 of whom you see up here have been elected to Parliament in 2013. And are just partnerships in East Africa that have created lifelong friendships. And as I'm sure Chris and some others on the group can attest to, St. Lawrence graduates have gone to Kenya and worked professionally and made a real impact in various areas. And we just want to take a chance to celebrate that. And so I encourage you to visit the reunion website to check out some more information. We'll have new updates all along. Those of you who have been connected to the program should be receiving some official invitation letters soon and some regular communication updating you on this. And I hope to see some of you at reunion. So I'm happy as well to field questions if anyone wants to talk about reunion as well as the kind of Kenyan history.
We're just taking a look again to see if there are any comments or questions out there. Again, if you have a comment or question, raise your hand.
Type.
In addition, we did just turn on the feature to allow you to type in your question. So if you're feeling a little shy tonight and don't want to actually say your question in front of the group, but want to type in a comment or a question, please feel free to do that as well. We'll just.
Or if you don't have a microphone, you might not be able to.
That's right. If your microphone is not working, please feel free to do that as well.
As people are thinking of any sort of final thoughts, I just wanted to. I just wanted to sort of look at a couple more things that I'd be able to kind of show everybody. I think we might have a question here.
Yep, it looks like Paul is saying that he'd love to ask a question.
Go ahead, Paul.
Go ahead and type it in, Paul. It looks like we're not seeing your hand raised. So let me try to call on you and see if you're able to actually if we're able to hear you. Paul, go ahead and try to ask your question or make your comment.
I don't know if we can hear you, Paul.
I don't think we can hear you. I know that Paul was using his computer audio, so that it might not be working. So Paul, if you do have a question and you're able to go ahead and type the question in, we can look at that as well.
As Paul is typing, I'm going to just kind of screen us forward here that one couple quick things I want to remind folks of. I put together a bibliography of some kind of things that are related to what I was talking about today. I'm attaching it here at the bottom end of the talk. I'll leave it up for a little while, but I wanted to mention particularly that I put together a PDF of this, and I'm happy and as to work with Kim to send it to everyone. If they're interested in learning more about this topic or perhaps reading some material on kind of Kenyan history and whatnot, I think these are useful resources, some of which are online. So there's some links here to some interesting things that some of my colleagues in African Studies also use in their teaching. broadly on Africa, but then particularly some of the kind of latest scholarship on this kind of notion of ethnicity and politics here in Kenya.
Great. Looks like we have a question or a comment from Drew Pinchon. Drew, go ahead and ask your question.
Drew?
Hey, Matt and Kim, can you guys hear me?
I can, we can.
All right, great. I'm actually sitting here with another KSP alum, and we were really fascinated by kind of the arc of tribalism and that concept since colonialism. And I know you're kind of putting you on the spot as a historian, but what do you see as a continuation in the next 50 years of the influence that these ethnic groups have, and as a new generation of Kenyans come into power who didn't experience colonialism, and how they'll associate with their ethnic groups going forward? So, and you can put us back on mute for the answer. Thanks, Matt. We've really appreciated this, and look forward to seeing you at reunion.
Okay, thanks, Drew, for that question. Well, as a historian, I'm hesitant to predict the future, but I would say that there is some interesting dilemma happening, particularly in the politics of Kenya now. I mean, I think, to go back to, I believe, Frederick's point about the new constitution and the provisions that are putting out there to really kind of create more local government. And I think, scholars who have taken a look at some of the election materials in 2013, this past election in March, have noted that people have broken either both kind of ethnic affiliations, but sometimes party affiliations at the local level, meaning that they may have voted for one person in one political party for president, but then they weren't voting sort of a party line, or they weren't sort of taking exactly that person's chosen candidates all the way down the list to the local officials. And I think some scholars are talking about this as being something that's really clearly signifying that that notion that these elite politicians can garner an entire ethnic group's support simply by making a few political speeches and being from that home area is diminishing. And I think scholars of democracy in Kenya are also encouraged by that sort of notion that people are making different choices at the local level, and that could be sparking some pretty interesting discussions over time. Great. Folks are typing in some comments just thanking us for doing the lecture tonight, and looking forward to receiving the bibliography via email as a PDF. We're just going to take one more final look to see if there are any remaining questions or comments before we conclude tonight's lecture. So just looking through the list of attendees one more time. Switch one slide here quick. I just wanted to, there's a second page, so this will also be included on the bibliography and maybe provide some links. But like much of African history in different parts of the continent, changing dramatically with technology, there's an increasing amount of interesting historic material that's ending up online. And I'm giving you a couple examples that are really applicable here to the talk. But particularly if you're interested in colonial history, there's a growing list of photographs. The first citation up here is actually about films, many of which are propaganda films that sort of reinforce a lot of the kind of discussions from colonial officials that we talked about tonight. And if you're interested in looking at sort of what life was like for many Luo speakers in the colonial era, there's an interesting visual history project at the Pitts Rivers Museum in Oxford that is all online from the very famous anthropologist E. Evans Pritchard. It's a couple hundred photographs from that region from 1902 all the way up until 1936. So I encourage you to look on this if you can capture it now, or hopefully we'll be able to get that bibliography to you very quickly. But I'd like to say thank you, and thank you again, Kim, and the Office of Laurentian Engagement for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you. I hope to see a lot of you at the reunion, and thank you for your interest in Kenyan history. It's an important topic both in African studies here, and particularly because of our close and deep connections with East Africa. So thank you.
And a special thank you to Matt for being willing to lead tonight's lecture, and thank you to all of you for participating. Right after the webinar, you'll receive a link to a brief survey, and I hope you'll take a moment to answer the questions, as your feedback will help us shape future lectures. So thank you so much, and have a great night.